Well, good morning, and thank you, Representative Chu. I'd like to start off my presentation here with just a couple photos that have taken place in our service territory, and then I'll explain where our service territory exists and a little more about Moon Lake Electric and who we are. So the photo to my right, your left, most of your left, was a snowstorm that took place this year. I tell people in the Uintah Basin we can have snow 9 to 10 months out of the year. This is just outside of the Strawberry Reservoir area where we had a real wet, heavy snow that came in, and the dynamics and the physics of this particular snowstorm wrapped the snow around our guy wire, and one of our linemen took a photo of that and sent it to me. And I thought I'd share that with you. And then the photo to your right, or left, whichever way you're looking at it, is a photo that was taken in our Altona area, which is District 1, up near Altamont. And one of our members actually was outside watching the thunderstorm that was taking place and captured this photo. If you look at that closely, you'll see that the thunder and the lightning there actually went around our power pole. We went and investigated that pole, and there was some burn marks, but it actually did not catch on fire. As the new CEO for Moon Lake Electric, one of my first goals was to look at our mission statement, and I wanted to make that short and concise and one that would be memorable for our members as well as our employees and our board of directors. And so our management team came together and we came up with these attributes. The first attribute is accountability. We feel like that's a necessity to our membership. So a number one priority of ours is to be accountable to our members who own us as a cooperative. The second one is transparent. Obviously, we definitely always want to be transparent in what we do. We have an open playbook, and we want to make sure that our members understand and feel comfortable with that. We also want to provide a reliable power, source of power. That's one of the topics I've been assigned today, to try to narrow that down into 30 minutes. When you talk about reliability and capacity and quality, we could spend days on each one of those. For me to package that into 30 minutes has been a real challenge, so hopefully I can motor through this very quickly. And not only supplying a reliable power to our membership, we also want to focus on safety and making sure that's a number one priority of ours, and making sure that we're safe in what we do and that we provide a safe, reliable power for our membership. I want to talk a little bit about our service territory. We start at the top of Daniel Summit Lodge, and we come all the way across through the Uintah Basin to western Colorado and the Rangeley, Colorado area. We're made up of 7,337 square miles, and we also have 41 substations in our service territory. On the screen, you'll see a little blue square that identifies the different substations in our service territory. Those are highly critical to the success of what we provide for our members. One of the reasons is that allows us to provide some redundancy in the event that we have a power outage. We have the ability to switch things up and try to get the power back on. I always like to share with our members that reliability is of utmost importance for us, and 98% of the time, with exception to the last 2 weeks. I apologize, the last 2 weeks has been rough on our system. 98% of the time, you flip the switch in our service territory and the power is there. I don't know how you can become more reliable than that. But we do have some issues facing us that is a real concern, and we're going to talk about how we're going to mitigate that and hopefully get beyond that in our service territory. We have just over 4,000 4,000 miles of line on our service territory, and 346 miles of that is actually transmission lines. So when you look at the screen there, you see a variety of different colors. We have 138 kV lines that go through our system. We have 69 kV lines that go through our system, and we have one 345 line that goes through our system that's owned and operated by our wholesale power provider in Deseret Generation. Most of you are aware of this, but you carve out one little section in our service territory, which happens to be Vernals, Mazer, and Naples. That was a decision that was made years ago, and we haven't discussed that, to my knowledge, recently, but that's operated by our friends in Utah Power and Pacificord. I want to talk a little bit about Moon Lake's portfolio. As you can see on the screen, 81% of our power comes from our Bonanza coal-fired plant. That's our baseload power, has been for years. Hopefully will continue to be for years to come. Made up of our portfolio, we also have 17% that we are allocated power from WAPA, which is Western Area Power Administration. That has since been reduced to 13%. With an additional price tag of $400,000. So we are paying more for less. And that's because of the current drought conditions that we are experiencing in the western United States. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the future as well, in the upcoming slides. We also have 1% that comes from our two small 1 megawatt power hydros. That we are unfortunately in the process of decommissioning because we've basically been regulated out of business with those two small hydros. That's the heart and soul of who we are, and that's been a really tough decision for our board and for our members, but it is something that we feel like is in the best interest for our cooperative at this point. We also have 1% of our power that comes from solar and net metering. So that's our entire portfolio. Things that we'd like to look at and possibly change in the near future is diversifying our portfolio where we're not so heavily dependent upon 80% coal. Some of those thoughts that we put into consideration is a solar renewable, more of a renewable interest. We aren't anti-renewable. I like to say that we're realist. And when I talk about being realist, I'll explain that a little bit later in a couple upcoming slides. But solar, I think, needs to be a portion of our portfolio. Our wholesale power provider, as I speak, is in the process of developing 70 acres of solar, of a solar project that's going to be about 12 megawatts, 12 to 13 megawatts. So we're excited to be doing actually we'll be doing the groundbreaking on that here in a couple weeks. So we're excited for that. We're also looking at different alternatives and options for, I have here listed microgrid. I apologize, that's kind of misrepresents what we're trying to do. They're more of a natural gas recip. When you think microgrid, you think of a grid that operates on its own. We're actually trying to produce these small 2.5 megawatt microgrids. In our service territory. In fact, we have an upcoming meeting in our Rangeley area and a couple other areas that we want to bring these natural gas recips online. One way to look at them is maybe more of a spinning reserve in the event that we get in a bind. We actually have something to go back to that will help us keep the power on for our membership. And then natural gas, obviously, given the location that we're at, we think natural gas should be a part of our portfolio as well. So how do we match up on a national scale? This is kind of an apples to orange picture here, so I apologize. I talked about source of power with Moon Lake, and now I'm going to talk about consumption of power on a national scale. So if you look at this particular graph, you're going to see that the United States is actually more diversified than our current portfolio and our service territory. Again, that's one thing that we're looking at to try to mitigate and make sure that we're a little more diversified in the coming years. If you look at what I refer to the Pac-Man of this slide, I think we're all probably old enough to know what Pac-Man is, and you cut out Pac-Man and just leave the 12% renewable, and let's be realistic, 2035, we're wanting to be dependent on 12% renewable. It just isn't going to happen. And I don't blame, on a national scale, I don't blame us to for pursuing that and being energetic. It's unrealistic, in my opinion. It's something that we need to be realist about, and I think I'll highlight a couple things that will back up what I'm saying there. I also find interesting that part of the renewable, it has wood. Obviously, that slide came off the federal government's website, so I found that interesting. If we look at, I talked about the 12% on a national scale. Obviously, Moon Lake only has 1%. If we look at this slide, it's showing two different things. It's showing actual capacity factor and stranded asset. And that's what, and this is, keep in mind, on a residential basis. So when we look at actual capacity from a solar unit on a residential basis, 20%, less than 20% of the time, it's going to be available. I talked about our service territory that you wake up in the morning, you flip the switch 98% of the time, the power's there. We'll reduce that significantly. When you're looking at national trends, 20% of the time, or less than 20% of the time, you flip the switch, 80% of the time, power is not going to be there. That's what we refer to as intermittent power and a stranded asset. Obviously, the summer months, you can see that the percentages are a little bit higher. And obviously, during the winter months, you can see that the percentages are a little bit lower. This slide here shows where we match up on a state basis. So obviously the state of Utah is more diversified than our current system. I'm going to slap us up next to it so that you can compare and contrast the two. You got 55% coal from the state of Utah. Obviously our service territory is 81% coal. They're more diversified. When you look at natural gas, Moon Lake has 0 in natural gas. Again, that's something that we're looking at in the near future with some of these natural gas recips that we can bring on board. Solar's up to 8%. We're 1% up. Well, on the first slide, this maybe is a little bit confusing for you folks, but on the first slide I showed 1%. Our WAPA power on that first slide was 17%. I said it was reduced to 13%. That 17% combined with our 1% is all hydropower. So 18% of our power on the Moon Lake system actually is generated through hydropower. And then the bulk of it comes from our base load in the Bonanza coal-fired plant. If you look at our rates, the state of Utah's average residential rate is just over 10 cents, 10.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Moon Lake's current rate is 5.6 cents per kilowatt hour. So we're well below the state average, and we're well below the national average of our power per kilowatt use. That's a real driver in our service territory, and I believe that's a huge benefit to you folks there. If we break this down in terms of revenue, I want you folks to understand that we know you are a big part of who we are. You are on our team. Maybe at times you haven't felt like that because we do have some capacity constraints, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. But the oil industry is 63% of our revenue. You take out you folks out of the equation, and we are struggling. And so you're a big part of who we are. We want you to know that we acknowledge that, and we also want you to know that we believe that we can do some pretty good things moving forward to help you try to bring more power to the Uintah Basin. If you break it down in commercial, that's 15%. We think of commercial businesses as the Duchesne County School District is a big part of our commercial load and revenue as indicated in this slide, as well as the grocery stores, just to name a few. 2% irrigation and 16% residential. I think most of you probably thought that we had a little more revenue coming from our residential base, but it's only 16% of our overall revenue from Moon Lake Electric. Frequently asked questions, and I've heard these terms mentioned throughout the morning. What is base load? So base load is a power that's generated, that's highly dependable and can be dispatched on demand. such as our Bonanza plant. They can dispatch that on demand, which leads into the next question, which is dispatchable power. I mentioned the term intermittent power earlier with a 20% production or capacity factor from solar. Baseload power, when you flip the switch 98% of the time. Intermittent power, when you flip the switch 80% of the time, it's not there. And so it's important to understand these terms. Just go through these real quick. What is capacity? My best definition of capacity is if you're in the business to sell widgets, whatever it is, oil, wax, natural gas, fuel, whatever your product is, if you're in the business of selling that and you have nothing on the shelf, you have no capacity. In our current situation, in our service territory, we have capacity constraints in a variety of different areas on our system. That is not good. That is something that we are looking to mitigate. You guys know this. You're knocking on our door saying, can you get power to us? And we're saying, I'm sorry, we can't. I'm going to explain what we're doing to try to mitigate that problem as well. If we decommission our base load resources, what happens to our service territory? The answer to that is we better get comfortable with lighting candles. Being the congenial person that I am, and because I will most likely be run out of town, Moon Lake will have their own alone episode. And one of the 10 items that we have thought about you guys with is our electric cooperative survival kit. We have matches, we have a candle, and we are generous enough to even provide some fuel for you. And this is something that maybe we're joking about, maybe we're not. When we have capacity constraints on our service territory and on a national scale, we have capacity constraints. I'll show that to you here in just a second. We aren't going to be lighting candles just for the smell. We're going to be lighting candles because we need it. This clip will show you that.
Joining us now is Jim Matheson, CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, an organization that represents more than 900 rural power companies, which provide electricity to 42 million Americans. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. What are some of the dangers of blackouts like this across American cities, and what parts of the country are most at risk for blackouts this summer?
Well, you mentioned the extreme heat, and so this can be life-threatening if people do not have electricity, cannot run their air conditioning systems. We've experienced it already in this country in past summers, and this summer looks like there's greater risk based on that report you just mentioned. The areas that are highest risk seem to be the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and also sort of the western half of the country. There's a lot of drought, hydroelectric production is reduced, and so there's lower supply in that part of the country as well. So those would be the areas that are the highest risk for this summer.
He's the CEO of over 900 co-ops, just over 900 co-ops, providing power to roughly 42 million Americans. We are part of that. We are one of the 900 co-ops. We have 23,000 meters, 13,000 members on our system. Obviously, you can see by the look of the map here that this is in our area. This is a concern in the Midwest. This is a concern on a national scale. How do we go about mitigating this? Well, a couple things I just want to talk about prior to getting into what we're doing. The United States, it's important to highlight this. There's 3 major power transmission systems in the United States, and I believe all of you understand this and are familiar with this. There's the Eastern Interconnect. There's the Western Interconnect, and then there's the standalone Texas Interconnect. We all remember, if we dial back what happened in February of 2021, the impacts that had on the Texas residents. For those that don't remember, let me highlight it. 4.5 million homes and businesses went without power during this crisis. Their power bill went from a normal $50 per megawatt to upwards of $9,000 per megawatt. I went and did some research and found some articles on how that directly impacted some businesses and the state of Texas, as well as some individuals, and I'll share those with you in just a second. You think that's not going to impact us? Just a year and a half, 2 years ago, when the California heat crisis and the wildfires took off, that drove our market from the norm of $40 per megawatt to upwards of $6,000 per megawatt. Folks, that's going to impact us. When we talk about decommissioning our base load resource to hit a goal of 2025, 100% renewable, it's going to be a challenge. It's really scary, and it's something that we are trying to prepare our service territory for. Here's some of the clips that we pulled out of a variety of different newspapers and media from the Texas area. So let's take Mr. DeAndrew, who had a normal bill, power bill of $80. On a bad month, $300. In the 7-day period of the Texas crisis, $6,700. That's $957 a day that he had to pay for his power bill. In some cases, those residents were better off not having power because of these astronomical bills that were presented to them at the end of the crisis. Some would say that the state was spending roughly, well, the state, some were saying that the state could have prevented this by taking steps, Texas being, ERCOT being on their own, that they could have taken some steps to prevent this. According to the Bloomberg Express, they talked about the week of February 15th as being marked down as the most expensive week in the history of the United States because of this crisis. As I mentioned, it took electricity bills. The state could spend some $50 billion on electricity, and it drove it upwards 10 times of the norm. CPS Energy says that not only did this impact electricity and the power rates, remember what was happening at the gas pump? I don't know if this is true or not, but there was people taking Walmart gas bags and filling it up full of fuel and putting it in their trunk. Remember the lines that was associated with it at the gas pump? It went 16,000% higher with natural gas prices. This isn't just a driver in the electric world. This is a driver in what you guys do as well, and it could potentially and will potentially impact us if we don't start looking at ways to mitigate it.
Last April, the U.S. did set a target to create a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035. So do you think that's an attainable goal, or is it too ambitious? And what more can be done then if it is too ambitious?
It's clearly too ambitious. It's going to put the grid at great reliability risk if public policy made that happen. Let's remember, we're also looking at decarbonizing the rest of our economy, including the transportation sector. Think back to the Super Bowl a few months ago where all the commercials are about electric vehicles. We got to be generating more electricity in this country if we're going to do that. And we're talking about reducing our reliable supply of generating capacity. That doesn't work. So if you want to make meaningful carbon reduction economy-wide, this rapid effort to take the electricity sector all the way down to zero isn't a good idea. I don't think it's technologically feasible. I think it puts the rest of our economy at risk because we're electrifying more of our economy in the future. Policymakers need to understand that there's a pragmatic and practical way to go about doing this. Zero by 2035, I don't think it makes sense.
All right, well, hoping that all those folks in those areas that you mentioned do have a backup plan for this summer in case of those rolling blackouts.
Too ambitious. Think back to the Super Bowl a few months ago when all of, or a majority of the commercials were geared around electric vehicles. I mean, we're trying to drive a much bigger need for energy and at the same time take down our reliable sources. That's something that we have to think about, and it's something that's definitely a concern for us in our service territory. So what are we doing to meet the challenge? If you look at NERC, was an acronym for Northern American Electric Reliability Corporation, they're saying, as we have mentioned a little bit earlier, that this summer we're going to hit some some really, in different parts of the United States, we're going to have some capacity constraint issues. And why is that? Well, the lack of transmission, that's in our area. Drought impacts, that's going to impact our service territory. Power plant outages due to fuel shortages. It was talked about earlier how the drought impacts our power plants and could impact our fuel as well that powers us. Supply chain issues. Who isn't dealing with supply chain issues in the room? And we're talking 15 to 20 megawatt transformers right now, 4 years out. That's not realistic. And if we have a large business come into our service territory right now and ask for an additional load that's going to require a 15 megawatt transformer, we're waiting 4 years. I mean, supply chain is a real issue right now. And then also cybersecurity and a variety of other things that we're dealing with. So what are we doing? This is the part I think most of you are here and wanting to know a little more about. We've been very open and transparent about this 46-mile transmission line that we're building from the Bonanza plant to south of the Roosevelt office on Pole Line Road that we're calling our Pole Line substation. We've already built 5 miles of that. That was in 2017, 2018. Right behind the Fort Duchesne U Plaza store, near our Fort Duchesne substation, we have built a line that's 5 miles going to the BLM treaty line. And that has already been in construction and built and paid for. We also have 33 miles of BLM property that we have to permit. Anyone want to take a stab at what that normally takes to permit? The average is 15 years for a project of this size. We were able to do that in just under 7 years, thanks to our great staff at Moon Lake and really pushing and trying to thread the needle on this. It was remarkable that we were able to get that done. This gives a visual of where that is. The pinkish color represents sage grouse designated areas. I say it's permitted. It doesn't come without some blemishes. We can only build in certain times of the year and certain times of the month. We're very challenged with trying to build a project of this size. It's 33 miles. We're going to pick up where we dropped off on the 5-mile stretch, and then we're going to build it all the way out to the Bonanza power plant. We currently use 146 to 153 megawatts per month. This line we're hoping will bring us another 80 to 100 megawatts to our service territory. It's a big project, probably noted as one of the biggest projects financially in the history of Moon Lake. And so we're really pushing to make sure that we can get this done. It's going to cost us about 25 to 40 million. Just to build the line, it's going to be 25 million, and trying to branch it out to our areas that have capacity constraints is going to be another 15 to 20 million, depending on where we sit with the supply chain constraints. I asked our staff to highlight something on this map that would be a landmarker, and they highlighted the Roosevelt sewer ponds. And I guess, I'm not sure if there was some humor behind that or not, but building a transmission line is very similar to a sewer pond. No one wants them. No one wants them in their front yard. No one wants them in their backyard. They're not pleasant to look at, but they are a necessity to life. And if you look at the pole line substation, it's just south of our Roosevelt office. You'll see 3 markers there. The blue line identifies the current 345 line that's owned by Deseret Power. That goes to Mona, Utah, as well as has a drop-off in our Upauco substation. The line in the middle, that's the red-white mixed color, that is our proposed route on the 7.75 private property acreage. The green, fluorescent green line identifies the boundary of the easement that Deseret has obtained. So we're going to be running through here. That'll pick up at the end of the Fort Duchesne substation and come 7.7 miles towards our office, building a new substation in the pole line area. That yellow line at the very bottom, some of you have probably heard about the Transwest project. That line shows their proposed route for the Transwest, which is a 500 DC line, wind energy line coming out of Wyoming, headed towards the west. We cannot tap into that. That's a 500 DC line. In conclusion, I just want to show this. If you don't think outages and brownouts and blackouts will impact us and how they impact us, I mentioned earlier at the start of my presentation that we've had a rough couple of weeks. This is actually the switch pole just outside of our Fort Duchesne substation where the switch actually went out. That was July 27th, started at 8 p.m. We were trying to dispatch crews and get everything out. By the time I could get out there, it was a little later in the evening, and I took the opportunity. Hopefully there's no law enforcement in attendance. If so, it was not me driving. It was a guy by the name of Robert Urisk. And we filmed this, and it was right down 40. And just outage and a brownout doesn't just impact our individual homes. This also has impacts in our community. So at the gas pump, at the eating establishments, the school systems. Some of you will recognize we're driving right by, getting close to Pizza Hut. Off to the left there is Taco Bell. Going past the Duchesne County School District, administrative offices, USU, impact stoplights. You'll see as we get here, there's not enough law enforcement in our community to man every stoplight. And so obviously this becomes a four-way stop at this point. We had vehicles backed up to Hilltop on this particular situation. I'm headed out to the Fort Duchesne sub as we're going right now. And just wanted to show what it looks like to be in outer darkness. This was when I returned. Look at the difference. 11 p.m. Unfortunately, that is not something we are proud of. We typically only have a 15 to 20-minute outage when we have this, but because we have capacity constraints on our service territory, we deal with a little longer outages now. So that shows the picture of Pizza Hut before and after and Taco Bell before and after. And you can see what light does to our community. I heard reports that the grocery store was just an hour or two away from having to throw away inventory. I mean, that's something to think about. I see CEO Jim Marshall there. Fortunately, they have a backup generator there. I think others do. That would be devastating if it impacted a life. But these are life-changing events. These are things that can and will impact us. So in conclusion, I just want to highlight just a few things. One, capacity constraints on a national scale is real, and we're seeing it in our service territory. Reliability, think about it, 98% of the time. Base load provides power for us 80% of the time. Renewable doesn't. Again, I am not renewable, anti-renewable. I want that to be part of our portfolio. To go 100% by 2035, too ambitious, unrealistic. And then also I'd like to thank the Moon Lake employees for keeping the power on. They're the ones that's out there. We have just under full-time and part-time employees. We have just under 100 employees. They keep the power on for us, and they keep us from having any type of natural catastrophes and disasters in our service territory. So I'd like to thank them for their efforts and providing quality, reliable, safe power. And that is the end of my presentation.